Her brother, the king, called her a traitor. He stripped her of her title and her name, sentencing her not to the mercy of a blade, but to the slow, agonizing death of the frozen wastes. Left to perish, Princess Isolda's hope was a dying ember in the snow. But her fate would not be decided by a cruel king. It would be claimed by the one man as cold and unforgiving as the North itself. A reclusive lord who found a princess at the edge of death, and in saving her, would choose to defy a crown. The air in the throne room was as cold as the marble beneath Isolda's feet. It was a new cold, a sharp and deliberate chill that had little to do with the winter outside and everything to do with the man sitting on the throne. Her brother, King Alaric, looked down at her, his face a mask of stern justice that did not quite fit him. It was a size too large, the expression of a boy playing at being a king, but the power he wielded was no game. The court was silent. Hundreds of lords and ladies, people who had watched her grow up, now refused to meet her gaze. They studied the tapestries, the floor, the arched ceilings, anywhere but at the princess standing alone before the throne. Their silence was a verdict in itself, a wall of fear she could feel pressing in on her. She felt a surge of betrayal, so sharp and bitter it threatened to steal the air from her lungs. Alaric's voice echoed in the cavernous space. "Isolda of House Valerius, you stand accused of high treason." The words were absurd, a poisoned dart wrapped in velvet. She had loved her brother, had celebrated his coronation just months ago, believing he would be a good king, a just king. She looked at him, searching for a flicker of the boy she grew up with, the one who brought her wild flowers and told her stories of dragons. There was nothing left of him. Only the cold ambition of the crown remained. "You have conspired with foreign agents," he continued, his voice rising with practiced authority. "You have sought to undermine the stability of this kingdom, to poison the loyalties of my subjects, and usurp the throne which God himself saw fit to grant me." Isolda did not speak. What could she say? Denial was a traitor's first resort. To beg would be to admit weakness. She simply stood, her posture straight, her head held high. This was her only weapon now, the quiet dignity that he could not strip from her. She could feel his frustration, his anger that she would not crumble, that she would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. He wanted the court to see a snake. Instead they saw a princess, and it enraged him. "Your silence is your confession," he spat, his composure finally cracking. He leaned forward, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of the throne. "This court finds you guilty." A collective breath was drawn by the assembly, a faint hiss of shock and fear. "You will not be granted the mercy of a swift death," Alaric declared, a cruel smile touching his lips. "Martyrs are remembered. You will be forgotten." He stood, his shadow stretching long and thin across the marble floor, swallowing her. "I strip you of your name and titles. You are no longer princess. You are no longer of House Valerius. You are nothing. You will be exiled from this kingdom, taken to the northern border, and cast into the frozen wastes. Let the ice be your judge, and the blizzards your executioner." The sentence settled over the room, a shroud of absolute horror. The frozen wastes were not just land. They were a legend, a place from which no one, not even the hardiest hunters, ever returned. It was a death sentence delivered not by an axe but by the slow grinding cruelty of nature itself. Two guards, their faces impassive, stepped forward. One of them reached for the silver brooch on her shoulder, the ancient sigil of her family. Isolda flinched as he roughly tore it from her cloak, the sound of ripping fabric echoing louder than any scream. She felt the violation keenly, a physical severing from everything she had ever been. She did not struggle as they gripped her arms and turned her from the throne. She walked with them, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to grant her brother a final look. As she was pulled from the hall, she felt hundreds of eyes on her back, a mixture of pity and relief, pity for her fate, and relief that it was not their own. They dragged her through the castle, down stone corridors, and out into a bitter courtyard. She was thrown onto a horse, her hands bound. The ride was long and silent, lasting for days. each league taking her further from the world she knew and closer to her doom. Her captors gave her stale bread and cold water, speaking not a word to her. She was already a ghost to them. Finally they stopped. Before them lay a vast, empty expanse of white. The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to whip through her very soul, carrying with it the promise of endless cold. The trees were skeletal, the sky a sheet of unforgiving gray. This was the edge of the world. A guard cut the ropes on her wrists and shoved her from the horse. She fell to her knees in the deep snow, the brutal cold instantly seeping through her thin cloak. The guards turned without a backward glance, their mission complete. They were leaving her to die. Isolde rose slowly, her body trembling. She watched them ride away until they were just small dark specks against the snow, and then they were gone. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The wind howled around her, stealing her breath, whispering of the inevitable. There was no path, no shelter, no hope. There was only the white death stretching in every direction. Her sentence had begun, not with the slam of a dungeon door, but with the vast, profound silence of a world that had already abandoned her. Days bled into a white, featureless agony. Isolde walked until her feet were numb, senseless blocks of ice. She walked until she no longer remembered why she was walking, only that to stop was to die. The wind was a constant predator, tearing at her thin cloak, stealing the warmth from her bones and whispering her failure with every gust. Her memories of the sun-warmed courts of her home became a cruel torture. She thought of her mother's smile, the scent of roses in the royal garden, the weight of a heavy velvet gown. They were ghosts from another life, a world away from this frozen hell. Her defiance, once a shield of pride, had been ground down to a single, stubborn instinct: survive. But the North was patient, and it was relentless. Her body, already weakened by grief and starvation, began to betray her. She stumbled and fell, the snow a deceptively soft blanket that invited her to rest, to sleep. Each time she forced herself up, her limbs screaming in protest. Finally she could go no further. She saw a shallow depression at the base of a rock, a small respite from the biting wind. It was not shelter, but it was enough. Isolde crawled into the space, curling her body into a tight ball, a final futile effort to preserve the last flickers of her life. The world began to dissolve into a soft, gray haze. This is how it ends, she thought, not with a fight, but with a surrender. Through the swirling snow and her fading consciousness, two figures appeared. They were large men, clad in the thick, rough-hewn furs of northerners. For a delirious moment hope surged through her, a painful, forgotten warmth. They had come for her. One of the men knelt, his face weathered and hard. He looked at her with an appraising, indifferent gaze, like a hunter checking a trap. "A southerner," he grunted to his companion, "dressed in silk and nearly frozen solid, nothing we can do for her." The other man nodded, his breath misting in the frigid air. "The North has already claimed her. Let it have her. We move on." The first man stood, and they prepared to leave her to her fate. Isolde's last flicker of hope died, and she closed her eyes, letting the darkness pull her under. But then a third figure emerged from the blizzard, larger and more imposing than the others. He moved with a quiet authority that made the two rangers fall silent and dip their heads in deference. It was Lord Boren. He did not speak. His gaze fell upon the crumpled form in the snow. From beneath the layers of fur that framed his face, his eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold and clear. He saw what his men saw, a woman at the edge of death. But he also saw what they had missed, the delicate stitching on her torn cloak, the impossible fineness of the fabric beneath the grime. And there, on her shoulder, he saw the few remaining threads of a silver sigil, the unmistakable crest of the royal house that had betrayed his own. A strange feeling stirred in him. It was not pity. Pity was a southern luxury, a weakness he could not afford. It was something colder, harder. It was a surge of profound, grim satisfaction at the sight of his old enemies. Weakness mingled with a stark recognition of the injustice, No one, not even the daughter of a treacherous king, deserved to be thrown away like refuse. To die in a formal execution was one thing. To be left for the wolves was another. In a land where survival is the only virtue, what makes a man stop for a stranger he has every reason to hate? Is it a flicker of compassion, or is it the cold refusal to let an old enemy write the final chapter of a life? The two rangers watched, bewildered, as their lord dismounted. He walked to Isolde's side, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. He knelt, his movements economical and sure. With a gloved hand he brushed the snow from her face. Her skin was almost translucent, tinged with blue, but he felt the faintest trace of warmth, a life that was stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. Wordlessly, Lord Boren gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against the solid strength of his chest. For a fleeting moment, as he lifted her, Isolde's eyes fluttered open. She saw only a dark shape, a face framed by shadow and fur, and felt an overwhelming sense of being lifted out of the cold, a feeling of impossible safety. Then the world went black. He carried her to his horse, a great black war-horse as formidable as its master. With practiced ease, he settled her in front of him and wrapped his own heavy cloak around her small form. He turned the horse around, not back the way he had come, but toward the looming gray silhouette of a fortress in the distance. His men exchanged a look of disbelief, but said nothing. They simply fell in line behind their lord, their unquestioning obedience a testament to the power he commanded. The lord of Stoneheart Hold, a man who had never offered comfort or kindness to anyone, was riding back to his keep with a half-dead southern princess in his arms. She had been saved from the jaws of the blizzard, only to be delivered into the heart of the stone. Warmth was the first thing she felt. A deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to soak into her very marrow, chasing away a cold so profound she had thought it would be her tomb. For a long moment she simply lay there, adrift in the sensation, believing it to be a dream, a final kind hallucination before the end. But the warmth did not fade. Slowly, other senses returned, the crackle and spit of a fire, the scent of wood smoke, and something else, something clean and wild like pine. The heavy weight of furs piled on top of her. Isolde's eyes fluttered open. She was not in the snow. She was in a bed, in a room. The ceiling above her was made of thick, dark timber beams, and the walls were rough-hewn gray stone. A large fire roared in a stone hearth across the room, its flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The room was stark, furnished only with the bed, a heavy wooden chest, and a single chair. There were no tapestries, no paintings, no comforts of the South. It was a room, built for function, not for beauty. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of warmth. Where was she? Who had brought her here? She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she saw that she was dressed in a simple, coarse-spun linen shift, her own ruined royal dress gone. She was a prisoner. The thought was immediate and absolute. She had been saved from the winter, only to be caged by a stranger. With trembling legs, she slid from the bed, her bare feet meeting the cold stone floor. The furs were heavy, a mix of wolf and bear, and they smelled of the wild. She went to the door first, a massive slab of dark wood with iron hinges. Her heart pounded as she reached for a latch. It was not locked. This discovery did not bring relief, only a deeper confusion. What kind of prison was this? She opened the door a crack and peered out. A long, empty corridor of gray stone stretched in either direction, lit by the flickering, smoky light of torches set in iron sconces. There was no one there. The silence was unnerving, as profound as the silence of the snow-covered wastes. She retreated back into the room, her mind racing. She was too weak to run, and even if she could, where would she go? The single arrow-slit window showed nothing but a swirling wall of white. The blizzard still raged. Her prison was not the room, but the fortress itself, a stone island in a sea of ice. Later, she did not know how much. Later, she heard A soft scraping sound outside her door. She held her breath, pressing herself against the far wall. The door creaked open, and a woman entered. She was stout, dressed in practical wools, her face weathered and unreadable. The woman did not look at Isolde. Her movements were swift and silent as she placed a wooden tray on the chest, retrieved the empty water pitcher, and left, closing the door softly behind her. Isolde stared at the tray. It held a steaming bowl of thick, hearty broth, a chunk of dark bread, and a pitcher of fresh water. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so intense it was painful. For a moment her pride warred with her desperation. To eat was to accept the charity of her captor, to acknowledge her complete powerlessness. But her body, starved and broken, made the decision for her. She devoured the food, the simple meal more satisfying than any royal feast she had ever known. This became the rhythm of her days. She would sleep, wake to the warmth of the fire, and find food and water left for her by a silent servant. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was not her own. She regained her strength slowly, the warmth and the food, knitting her body back together. She knew where she had to be. This was the North, and there was only one man who ruled a fortress this formidable, a man whose name was spoken in whispers in the southern court, Lord Boren, a man whose family had been destroyed by the political machinations of her own. He had every reason to want her dead, to parade her as a trophy of his family's revenge. Yet he had not. He had pulled her from the snow and given her a warm room, a fire, and food. The mercy was as unnerving as any cruelty. It was a language she did not understand. The warmth had healed her body, but the silence gnawed at her spirit. She knew she could not remain a ghost in this stone fortress forever, a phantom fed and ignored. Sooner or later, she would have to face the man who had pulled her from the grave and discover what price he would demand for her life. When her strength returned, a restless energy took its place. Isolde could no longer stay confined to her chamber, a well-fed ghost in a warm room. She began to walk the stone corridors of Stoneheart Hold, exploring her prison. The simple linen shift she wore was no match for the drafts that snaked through the halls, and she often found herself shivering, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. One afternoon, standing before a tall, arched window and watching the endless dance of the snow, a chill set deep into her bones. From the far end of the hall, shrouded in shadow, Lord Boren watched her. He saw her shiver, saw the way she hugged her thin frame. His face remained a mask of cold indifference, but the narrator could see the thought that sparked in his mind. It was a practical, tactical thought. The prisoner was not properly equipped for the climate. An oversight. He gave no sign that he had seen her. But when Isolde returned to her room that evening, something new was laid across the heavy wooden chest. It was a dress of dark blue wool, thick and plainly cut, but expertly made, and beside it a magnificent cloak of pure white wolf fur, so thick and soft it seemed to still hold the wild spirit of the animal. It was warmer and more luxurious than anything she had ever owned. She touched the fur, her fingers sinking into its depths. This was no simple provision. This was a statement. She slowly put on the dress and wrapped the heavy cloak around her shoulders. The weight was substantial, protective. It was like being wrapped in the safety of the fortress itself. For the first time, she felt not like a prisoner, but like someone being shielded. Driven by a need for purpose, her explorations led her to a forgotten part of the keep. It was a small, dusty room with a wall of thick, leaded glass, a solar built to catch the meager winter sun. A few hardy plants in clay pots sat on a stone ledge, their leaves brown and drooping, clinging stubbornly to life. A profound sense of pity moved her. They were as displaced and neglected as she was. She began to tend to them. She fetched water, cleaned the dust from their leaves, and turned their pots to face the sun. It was a small, quiet task, but it was hers. It was an act of creation in a place that felt dedicated to endurance alone. She did not know that the lord of the keep watched. her sometimes from the shadows of the doorway. He saw the gentle way she cared for the dying plants, the focused grace in her movements. He had expected a soft southern princess who would wither in his harsh world. He did not expect someone who would try to make things grow. The next day, sitting on the stone ledge beside the pots, was a set of small iron gardening tools. There was no note, no messenger, just a silent acknowledgment, a silent permission. The first time she dared to enter the great hall for the evening meal. Her heart pounded with fear. The hall was filled with Boren's warriors, large bearded men with scarred faces and silent stares. They watched her as she entered, their eyes following her as she found a seat alone, at the end of a long, empty bench. At the head of the hall, on a raised dais, sat Lord Boren, a remote and intimidating figure. A servant approached her, and she flinched, expecting to be told to leave. But prompted by a sharp, almost imperceptible glance from his lord, the servant placed before her a plate piled high with roasted meat, bread, and winter vegetables, and filled her goblet with warmed, spiced wine. It was the best portion in the hall. It was a public, unspoken declaration that echoed louder than any words. She is with me. She is protected. The stares of the men softened from suspicion to a grudging respect. Feeling a fragile sense of belonging, Isolde began to see the keep not as a prison, but as a wounded home. In the great hall hung the banners of Lord Boren's house, their sigil, a great northern bear. One of the oldest banners was faded, and near the bottom a long tear marred the image. It was a small flaw, but it pained her. Over several days, using fine thread she had carefully unraveled from the hem of her own ruined royal dress, she began to mend it. Her stitches were small and perfect, a skill taught to her in another life. She worked when the hall was empty, her small secret act of gratitude. Late. One night, Lord Boren stood alone before the banner. The firelight flickered across the ancient fabric, illuminating the fresh, meticulous repair. He reached out and ran his calloused fingers, hands accustomed to the grip of a sword, over the delicate silken stitches. It was a touch of impossible gentleness in his harsh, violent world. This was not the work of a prisoner. It was the work of a lady taking pride in her house. A profound confusion warred within him, a crack in the icy wall he had built around his heart. He had brought her here to spite a king, to hold a living symbol of southern weakness. But she was not weak, and her quiet acts of grace were beginning to feel less like a prisoner's submission and more like the gentle tending of a home. She was beginning to see the man behind the stone-faced lord, but she could not know that in her quiet dignity she was tending to a wound far deeper than any tear in a banner, a wound he had carried since the day the South had stolen his family. The Lord of Stoneheart Hold was not born of ice and stone. He had been forged. He would watch her sometimes when she thought she was alone. He watched as she moved through the solar, her slender fingers tending to the struggling green leaves. He watched her in the great hall, a still, quiet presence that somehow drew the eye more than the boisterous, loud warriors around her. There was a grace to her movements, a gentle dignity that was as out of place in his harsh fortress as a summer rose. And in those moments the stone walls of his memory would crack, and the ghost of another life would bleed through. The narrator remembers a boy, not yet a lord, with a quick smile and a future that had not yet been stolen. This boy had a family, a stern, proud father who had taught him the weight of honor, a mother with a warm laugh, whose southern blood made her a diplomat in a land of warriors, and a younger sister, Lyra, who had her mother's smile, and a spirit as gentle as a fawn. Lyra had loved to tend to the small wild blossoms that fought their way through the northern frost each spring. She had a touch that coaxed life from the hard ground. The old king, Isolde's father, had invited them south. It was to be a grand wedding, a gesture of unity between the two lands. The king had sent a letter penned in his own hand, promising safe passage, guaranteeing their protection under his royal seal. Borin's father, a man who valued honor above all, had believed him. He had believed in the promise of peace. Borin, just a boy of 15, had stayed behind to manage the keep. He remembered waving goodbye as their carriage rolled south, his mother's laughter echoing back to him, his sister's small hand waving from the window until they were gone. They never came back. The story that trickled back north was one of politics and betrayal. An ambush on the road by rival southern lords. A convenient savage attack that the king was either complicit in or too weak to punish. It did not matter which was true. The result was the same. His father, his mother, his little sister Lyra, all gone. Slaughtered on a southern road under a banner of royal protection that had meant nothing. Borin became the lord of Stoneheart Hold overnight. Grief was a luxury he could not afford. He packed his heart in ice, locking away the memory of his mother's laugh and his sister's gentle hands. He learned the brutal lessons the South had taught him. Promises are lies. Trust is for fools, and warmth is a weakness that leads only to the grave. He built his walls high, both stone and spirit, and ruled his land with a cold, hard justice that kept his people safe, but left no room for love. Now, 2 decades later, he would watch Isolde humming softly as she repaired a fraying tapestry in a forgotten corner of the hall. And for a heart-stopping moment, he would not see the daughter of the king who had failed him. He would see Lyra, her head bent over a task, with that same quiet focus. The instinct to protect her was a raw, primal thing, a duty buried so deep he had forgotten it was there. But it was tangled with a lifetime of bitterness and distrust for her name, for the southern court that had bred her. He had taken her in to spite her brother, to hold a pawn in a game of kings. But she was not a pawn. She was a woman who mended banners and nurtured life, who moved through his cold, empty halls and filled them with a quiet grace he had not known they lacked. He was her protector. This was true. He had saved her from the snow. But as he watched her bring faint warmth and color back into the gray stone corners of his life, he did not realize that she, in her gentle, unknowing way, was becoming his cure. She was tending the wounds he thought were fatal, proving that even in the harshest winter, something could still grow. For the first time in 20 years, the halls of Stoneheart Hold did not feel like a tomb. They began to feel like a home. But peace, especially in the north, is a fragile thing, easily shattered. And the shadows of the south, having cast out their own princess, were long, and they were growing longer still. The fragile peace inside Stoneheart Hold had a rhythm. It was in the quiet crackle of the fire, the soft scrape of Isolde's trowel in the solar, the silent nod of a guard as she passed. It was a life built in the unspoken spaces between two lonely people, a shelter woven from small acts of care. This peace was shattered by the sound of a horn. It was a single, arrogant blast, thin and sharp in the heavy northern air. It was a southern sound, impatient and demanding. From her window in the solar, Isolde saw them. A small party of riders, their colorful silks and polished steel, looking garish and foolish against the endless white snow. At their head, a man held a banner bearing the golden lion of her family, the sigil of the brother who had condemned her. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in her stomach. They had found her. Lord Borin met the envoy in the lesser hall, a stark chamber with a single high-backed chair for its lord. The herald, a man named Sir Cale, strode in as if he owned the keep. He was slender, with a pointed beard and eyes that flickered with disdain, as he took in the rough stone walls and the grim, silent lord who stood waiting for him. Lord Borin, the herald began, his voice smooth and condescending, I bring greetings and a generous offer from His Royal Majesty, King. Alaric, Borin did not move. He did not invite the man to sit. He simply waited, his silence a wall of granite. The king has heard rumors, Sir Cale continued, a smug smile playing on his lips. Rumors of a stray southern woman who found her way into your lands. A pathetic creature, no doubt lost and confused. The king, in his mercy, wishes to relieve you of the burden of caring for her." Borin's eyes, cold as glacial ice, remained fixed on the herald. He gave nothing away, but inside him a familiar rage began to stir. It was the old, cold fury he had felt when the news of his family's murder had first arrived. The same southern arrogance, the same veiled threats wrapped in silken words. "The woman is a fugitive traitor," the herald said, his tone hardening. "She is to be returned to the capital to face the king's justice. Surrender her to me." He paused, letting the demand hang in the air before delivering the prize. "Do this, and the king will reward your loyalty. He offers you the title to the Sunstone Riverlands and a permanent seat on his royal council, a great honor for a northern lord, a simple test of your allegiance, you see." The offer was an insult, a bribe to trade a life for land, a demand that he break the sacred law of the North, the law of sanctuary, for a king he despised. Borin thought of Isolde, of her quiet strength, of the way she mended his banner and brought life to his keep. He thought of her being dragged back south into the hands of her cruel brother. When a king's law demands you betray the innocent, where does true loyalty lie? Is it in obeying the crown that sits on a tyrant's head, or in honoring the sanctuary you have built with your own hands? What is the greater treason, to defy a king or to defy the honor of your own house? Borin's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and dangerous, like the rumble of an avalanche. "You have traveled far. You must be weary." The herald, mistaking the cold calm for consideration, smiled. The journey was indeed taxing. "You will have my answer on the morrow," Borin stated. It was not an offer. It was a command. "In the great hall, before my men." Sir Kale's smile widened. He believed the Lord was simply making a show of it, that he would posture before his men, before inevitably bending the knee. No sane man would choose a nameless woman over the king's favor. He bowed shallowly and retreated, confident in his victory. News of the herald's demand swept through the keep like a plague wind. Isolde heard it in the sudden silence of the servants, saw it in the grim faces of the guards. They had come for her. She was a curse, a storm she had brought down upon the one place she had found safety. She retreated to her room, the white wolf-pelt cloak wrapped tightly around her, but it offered no warmth against the chill of her returning fear. That night a heavy silence fell over Stoneheart Hold. It was not the quiet of peace, but of a fortress holding its breath, gathering its strength for the battle to come. The Southern Herald slept soundly, dreaming of his rewards, but Lord Borin did not sleep. He stood before the roaring fire in the great hall, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his decision already made. On the morrow he would give his answer, and it would be sealed in either loyalty or blood. The next morning the great hall of Stoneheart Hold was filled to capacity. Lord Borin's warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their leather and mail a stark contrast to the colorful silks of the Southern Herald. They were silent, their faces grim, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons. The air was thick with a dangerous, waiting stillness. Sir Kale, the royal herald, stood before the empty dais, a smug and satisfied smirk on his face. He smoothed his velvet tunic, confident that this show of force was merely for the benefit of these northern savages. The Lord would make a speech, then hand over the woman. Power always recognized power. But then the heavy doors at the far end of the hall swung open. A collective breath was drawn. Isolde entered. She was not dragged by guards or presented as a prisoner. She walked in alone, her head held high. She wore the simple wool dress and the magnificent white wolf-pelt cloak Lord Borin had given her. The cloak was a symbol of the North, a mantle of honor, and she wore it not as a gift, but as her own. She did not look at the herald. She did not look at the warriors. Her gaze found Lord Borin as he descended the steps from the dais, and she walked, not to his side, but to the great central hearth, the symbolic heart of a northern home. She turned her back to the fire, facing the assembly, a silent, defiant queen in a court of stone and steel. The herald's smirk faltered. This was not part of the script. Borin stood before his men, his presence commanding the vast hall. He let the silence stretch, his eyes sweeping over his warriors before finally coming to rest on Sir Kale. The herald, regaining his composure, raised his voice. "Lord Boren, the time has come. The king awaits your display of fealty. By royal decree, I demand you surrender the traitor Isolde." Boren did not move. His gaze shifted from the herald to Isolde, who stood bathed in the warm light of the fire. She met his look, and in that single shared glance 1,000 words were spoken. Her fear was there, but beneath it was a bedrock of trust. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes held a promise of unwavering protection. He turned back to the stunned herald, his voice ringing with the cold, clear authority of a king in his own right. "There is no traitor here," Boren declared, his words cutting through the silence. He took a step forward, his voice dropping slightly, yet carrying to every corner of the hall. "There is no southern woman for you to claim." His eyes found Isolde's once more, a silent vow passing between them. "There is only the Lady of Stoneheart." For about a heartbeat there was stunned silence. Then the hall erupted. A deafening roar of steel on shields and jubilant shouts echoed from the stone walls. His men were cheering, their loyalty given not just to their lord, but to the lady he had just claimed for their house. They were not defending a fugitive. They were defending their own. Ignoring the chaos, Boren strode towards the pale, trembling herald. He plucked the royal scroll from the man's limp fingers. Without a word, he walked to the great hearth. He stood before Isolde, so close she could feel the heat from the fire and the cold fury that radiated from him. He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned and tossed the king's decree into the flames. They watched together as the parchment curled, the king's arrogant words blackening and turning to ash. The royal wax seal, the symbol of her brother's power, melted like a teardrop and was consumed. It was a declaration of war written in fire. Boren turned his lethal gaze back to the herald. "You have my answer," he said, his voice quiet and deadly. "Take it to your boy king. Tell him the North does not bargain, and it does not surrender its own." He gave a sharp, dismissive nod to his guards. Sir Kale stumbled backward, his face a mask of pure terror. He was spun around and frog-marched from the hall, his southern dignity left in ashes on the hearth. The hall began to empty as warriors, energized and ready, moved to secure the gates and prepare the fortress for a siege. The great room, moments before filled with sound and fury, grew quiet. Soon only 2 people remained, standing in the vast, echoing space, Boren and Isolde. The scent of burning parchment hung in the air between them, a promise of the war to come. He had named her the lady of his house. He had declared her his own in front of his entire world. The defiance was done. The consequences were just beginning. The great doors of the hall closed with a final booming echo sealing the world. Outside, the sound of retreating footsteps and shouted orders faded, leaving only the soft crackle of the fire on the hearth. Boren and Isolde stood alone in the vast sudden silence. The air between them was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of a line that had been drawn and a gauntlet that had been thrown into the flames. War was coming. A king had been defied. A life and a future had been irrevocably altered. He stood by the dais, a lord of stone and shadow. She stood by the hearth, a lady of fire and light. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the expanse of the hall, 2 solitary figures who had just bound their fates together with an act of open rebellion. Slowly, he began to walk toward her. His steps were measured, deliberate, the sound of his boots on the flagstones the only sound in the world. Isolde watched him approach. The fear that had been her constant companion for months was gone, replaced by a feeling she did not yet have a name for, a powerful, calming certainty that flooded her veins. She did not move. She did not flinch. She simply waited. He stopped before her, so close she could see the flicker of the fire reflected in his dark, intense eyes. She saw the storm of emotions there, the battle between the grim, wounded lord he had been and the man he was becoming. She saw the protector. She saw the loneliness. He raised his hand, a hand calloused by a sword's hilt and scarred by 100 battles. She thought he might place it on her shoulder, a gesture of possession or command, a formal claim, but he did not. His touch, when it came, was impossibly gentle. With a tenderness that defied everything she knew of him, he reached out and softly brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, tucking it carefully behind her ear. His fingers, rough and warm, barely grazed her skin, but a jolt went through her, a current of profound, staggering intimacy. It was a gesture so small, so simple, yet it spoke more than any vow or proclamation. It spoke of care. It spoke of seeing, not the princess, not the fugitive, but the woman who stood before him. A tear she did not know she was holding escaped and traced a single, silent path down her cheek. In response, she raised her own hand, but she did not wipe the tear away. Instead, with a courage that came from the deepest part of her heart, she reached out and took his hand in hers. She did not grasp it like a drowning woman seeking rescue. She held it with a quiet, steady strength, a partnership, an acceptance. He froze for a heartbeat, surprised by her action. He looked down at their joined hands, her slender, pale fingers against his larger, darker ones. It was a perfect contrast, a perfect fit. When he looked back up at her, the last of the ice in his eyes had finally melted away, replaced by a raw, unguarded warmth that took her breath away. Slowly, he turned his hand in hers, his fingers lacing with her own. It was a silent mutual agreement, a vow, made not with words but with a simple, profound touch. In that moment, he was not the lord of Stoneheart Hold, and she was not a banished princess. They were simply Boren and Isolde, two lonely souls who had found their sanctuary not in the stone walls of the fortress, but in each other. The great war with the South was yet to be fought. Armies would march and a crown would be contested. But in the quiet hall of Stoneheart Hold, the true battle had already been won. A reclusive lord had found his heart, and a banished princess had finally truly come home. The war that followed was exactly as the Southern king had intended it to be, brutal and swift, but the victory did not belong to him. King Alaric's knights, clad in shining steel and arrogance, were broken by the unforgiving northern winter and the guerrilla tactics of men who knew every rock and ravine. His supply lines froze, his armies faltered, and his own lords, seeing his weak and tyrannical reign laid bare, abandoned his cause. He was not overthrown by Lord Boren's army, but by the weight of his own crumbling ambition, his reign ending not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of his own castle gates against him, by men who no longer feared him. Justice, like the northern frost, had come silently and settled deep. 5 winters passed. 5 springs saw the return of green to the north. The world changed, but inside the walls of Stoneheart Hold, the peace that had been won remained. The solar, once forgotten, dusty room was now a vibrant sanctuary. Lush green plants climbed the stone walls, and hardy flowers bloomed in defiance of the snow that still blanketed the world outside the glass. The room was warm, filled with the soft light of a low afternoon sun. Isolde sat on a simple wooden bench, a book resting unread in her lap. She was no longer the pale, haunted girl who had stumbled out of a blizzard. Her face, framed by the same dark hair, was serene and confident. She was the Lady of Stoneheart, a title she wore with the same quiet dignity as the white wolf-pelt cloak that now rested on the back of the bench. The door opened, and Boren entered. The years had been kind to him. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He no longer looked like a man at war with the world, but a man at peace in his home. He crossed the room and stood behind Isolde, his hand coming to rest gently on her shoulder. She leaned back into his touch, a familiar, comforting gesture that was the foundation of their life together. Their gaze was fixed on the center of the room, where a small boy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined eyes, was concentrating fiercely. He stood on a thick bearskin rug, his small hands balled into fists, his legs wobbling with effort. The boy took one unsteady step, then another. A delighted, gurgling laugh escaped him as he looked to his parents for approval. Oren's hand tightened slightly on Isolde's shoulder, a shared silent joy passing between them. Isolde's answering smile was radiant. In a world of cruel words and cold injustice, how does a heart find its home? Is it in a palace, surrounded by the power of a crown? Or is it built slowly, quietly, through the steady, unspoken acts of care that turn a cold fortress into a sanctuary, one gentle touch at a time? The little boy took one more wobbly step and tumbled softly onto the rug, his laughter filling the warm, quiet room. Oren moved from behind the bench and, with an ease that spoke of long practice, knelt down and swept his son into his arms, settling him on his hip. He walked back to his wife, and their son reached out a small hand to touch Isolde's cheek. The lord of the northern hold, the banished princess, and the future of their house were together, a family forged not in politics or power, but in the ashes of a fire and the warmth of a shared glance. The north was still a land of ice and stone, but here, in the heart of the keep, winter would never touch them again. The tale of the Lord of Stoneheart and his lady is now told, but the fire is still warm, and there are many more stories to share. To join us for every new chapter of defiant love and quiet honor, to the Classel Chronicles.